Welcome to the show. I am your host, Todd Dallas Lamb, and you're listening to On the Clock. On the Clock is a venture with the Strategos Podcast Network, where we feature an array of guests to dive into all things education. We hope you enjoy. Welcome back to On the Clock. I am Todd Dallas Lamb, your host. Today I am happy to have as our guest Scott Kerwien, who is the Executive Director for Student Success at Spokane Public Schools in the great state of Washington. Scott, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Hope you're having a great day. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Great. I am... you and I spoke before, and I'm really fascinated about the aspect of your job. You've had a history of working as a counselor. So much of the buzz in education right now that I see in education is kind of trendy, right? Like there's topics that come and go. Some stay with us. Common Core was all anybody wanted to talk about 10 years ago. No Child Left Behind 20 years ago, right? Social and emotional learning is really a hot phrase right now. It has been for a while. But career and college readiness is also now a hot button item. And one of the areas that you focus on in your role with Spokane Public Schools is the issue of hope. Tell me a little bit about your history in education and how did you fall on that topic of hope, that very important topic?
Yeah, sure. I was a high school counselor for 9 years in 2 surrounding districts around Spokane here, and talking with students one-on-one and just hearing some universal situations in terms of what they were going through personally and how it was affecting their ability to be focused in the classroom, be future thinking, and what they wanted to do after high school. To me, high school from 9th grade to 12th grade is a pretty big developmental span, from going from a middle schooler to then having to make adult decisions about where you want to go for post-secondary education. And a lot of that, I think, for students brings up some anxiety and fear. And I think a lot of decisions being made or not made is because of that anxiety and fear. And so when I started trying to figure out what those barriers are for students, whether they were making it for themselves or whether others were making it for them, I started to resonate, especially for those students with depression issues and or suicidal thinking, that they lacked hope. And I didn't really name it that way until recently in the last year. I was on a statewide webinar with a program called KidSAP Strong, and they were talking about the impact of hope science, which has been studied at the post-secondary level, like Arizona State and Oklahoma in particular, that are kind of leading that area, but it hasn't kind of trickled down into, like you're saying, social emotional learning, into multi-tiered systems of support and these other ways that educators and school districts focus on in terms of, vocab and resources. Sometimes I think we might overthink it, and I'm really kind of wondering, and I've said to a few people in our district, how are we constantly, consistently instilling hope in our students? Because if we're not able to answer that question, then I think we're not really doing as much as we could for students, when all we care about might be if they turned in their last assignment in U.S. history, right? That is important to some teachers, and yet I want to make sure, as students experience anxiety and fear now in their future, that they actually have resources in their tool belt to understand, to encounter, and to move beyond that. And I think hope's a big tool in tackling any future problem for students.
How do you identify, what are some of the characteristics that teachers can look for that identify a student that lacks hope?
That's a good question, because the practical situation for most teachers in the day is whether or not a student's listening to you, whether a student's actually turning in their assignments, attending school at all. A lot of districts focus on that early warning system of attendance, behavior, and grades as the benchmark to make sure that students are successful. If kids aren't coming to school, then they're not going to do their homework, and they're not going to show academic progress, which means they're not going to be ready for their future steps. But in the moment, I think teachers are keenly aware of students that have some difficulties, right? If the kid's head's down on their desk, if they're acting out in a certain way, we might say that they just have a behavior problem in the moment, or they're just not coping and dealing with something. but they're clearly going through a stressor, right? And that's leading to something that they're doing or not doing in the classroom. And I think that if you were to ask some teachers if they could identify students that don't engage as much in their classrooms, that might be the first entry point into this hope conversation.
I feel like education, as traditionally understood in America, we sort of anticipate, 100 years ago, that a kid was going to come to class with two parents on their back telling them to do well. That hope would be kind of understood, and not understood maybe as much as it would be anticipated from a teacher's perspective. I think a lot of us wonder, how can a school actually, you address the issue of you identifying a hope deficit. What is the science saying about what you can do to instill hope where there might be a deficit?
Yeah, I think there's adjacent terminology that have been hot terms, to your point, in the recent past with education, like grit and growth mindset, self-efficacy. We use Panorama SEL surveys that have those as subcategories. So we ask students 32 questions as an SEL survey, and then fall and spring, we get to look at those students' answers because they're answering about themselves and their, potential ability on a 1 through 5 Likert scale on if they give up easily on things, if they believe that they can do something that's difficult, right? And that's some valuable information that we can dig into with students, and have teachers, counselors, building administrators be able to dig on that for a lot of students. The one difficulty that we all need to be aware of is that's one point in time. Like taking a survey once or twice a year can't possibly define what a student's going through at home, in school, on a regular basis. And that's where I think that focus on SEL as a broad term, and our opportunity as educators to really dig in with students individually as a group in a classroom, needs to be, how can we help students build belief in themselves, that no matter what they encounter personally, that they believe that they can do more than what's happening in the moment. And I think that future thinking has been used in the past for suicidal ideation, right? The most difficult thing that a student could be going through in the moment that leads them to think in that way is because they don't have belief that things can get better, and they don't have hope that they have the opportunity or skills to make anything be better. And it's difficult within that kind of aspect of control. If we're an adolescent student and our parents tell us we have to be a certain way in our household, or our household is a certain way with physical safety and security, then it's really hard sometimes when the blinders come down to see that anything can be better. And I think that's our opportunity to continually have conversations with students to say things can get better, not to be tone deaf at all, but to be trauma informed, to be culturally responsive to the needs of students.
So I talk to a lot of really smart people who focus a lot of their attention on autism, and I have this theory, and it's only my theory, but I think that the autism spectrum is much broader and longer and deeper than we think of traditionally. I think I have autistic spectrum aspects. I think my wife does, but we have arguments about that, right? But you talk to a lot of these folks who focused on it, and they said, this has always been a problem. Because the question is, are there more autistic kids today than there were 30, 40 years ago? And a lot of smart people will tell me that we just didn't identify it. We weren't good at identifying it. Has hope always been an issue in education? We just didn't identify it? Or is there something going on in this country that is leading to a hope deficit that wasn't there 30 years ago?
I love that question. I think my current stance would be it's always been around. It's just been viewed in different ways. And so timely to a lot of conversations, were there structures that existed that only allowed certain people to have certain hope beliefs about themselves because people, quote unquote, either knew the opportunities that they were given, or they knew the opportunities that would be taken away based on systems of power. And that accordingly started to narrow the scope of what there was to be hopeful for, right? I think the paradigm shift that currently exists is kind of like what you hear from different people, that everybody deserves a medal or a ribbon, right? And that every student has the opportunity to own their individuality and grow and achieve whatever they want to. And I think that's a difficult stance to take universally, but the concept I think, to your question, is to identify and really understand students uniquely for where they're at, to then understand how to nudge, how to encourage, how to motivate, to build that hope relative to that student and not a group at large. I think you kind of referencing the history of public education and taking a factory model is one size fits all. Like, I'm going to deliver this one lesson and you're going to either do it or not do it. And that's going to instantly develop what pathways are available for you in the future. And I think thankfully we're doing a little bit better to open that conversation, that there's winding paths, that there's ways above and around walls and barriers that exist for students. But the hope has to go alongside with that. Not from a naive perspective, but an opportunity to say, I really want you to have as many doors open as possible. And so I need to make sure I build hope so that when you encounter those barriers or you have people in your life telling you can't do things, that you really, really think through that very deliberately and identify for yourself what you're truly capable of doing in the future.
Do you think it's possible, 20 years ago, the only, buzzwords in education, 20 years ago, all anybody wanted to talk about was accountability. That a third grader who couldn't read at a fourth grade level does not need to move on to fourth grade until they can read at a fourth grade level. Accountability really kind of demands, doesn't it, that we're going to tell you what you need to learn, and you have to learn it, and if you're not good at learning it, you've got a problem. And do you think that kind of thinking has led to an increased lack of hope? And do you think that we need, and I now sense that we're moving with all the talk of assessment and dropping some of these assessment requirements, that we're moving to recognition that you can make a heck of a lot of money in this country by being good at one thing. And you can stink at four other things that we used to think were vital to successful American education. Do you think we're moving in the right direction? Do you think that thinking 20 years ago has helped reduce hope with regards to I stink at math, so I must not be a very good student?
Yeah, and I think the other, that's a very broad, a whole other conversation for sure. But the quick version is just because I don't get a couple units in math doesn't mean I'm bad at math, right? And so the messaging is important around saying, guess what? Your polynomials, you need a little bit more work on. You might have gotten a C on the last test, but you're not a C student. And I think the difficulty with public education sometimes is that we assign value to a letter grade and to a GPA and, to your point, to a test score. And so kids are savvy. When we used to give the PSAT for 8th graders, 9th graders, 10th graders, and 11th graders. And from 8th to 11th, you're not going to potentially grow that much in terms of points, right? And so when students compare with their friends and start to understand what an average score is at a college that they might want to go to in the future, they start to very quickly understand what their potential opportunities are based on a score and how that defines them. And so I think that us nationally, going test optional at colleges has, to your question, added a lot more opportunity for hope to be built in kids. This last year, we had a student from one of our high free reduced lunch high schools get admitted to Harvard without an SAT score. And when I looked in the background at his SAT score, I'm not sure it would have fit the middle 50% of accepted students at that school, right? And so having a 5 to 7% acceptance rate, but taking a student because of their personal narrative, because of their activities, because of who they are, and truly a holistic review that colleges promise, allows that student an opportunity that they might not have had based on previous accountability indicators, right, that you're kind of touching on in terms of quantitative metrics and how we like to define each other by numbers.
What are other countries, the fascinating phrase that I took from you already in this conversation is this concept that these universities are studying something called hope science. How's Japan doing with hope? How is Korea? How is Great Britain doing in the form of hope? Are they seeing similar issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the difficult part is how you scale public education in terms of other countries and the resources allocated, which I think is really nuanced when it comes to comparing countries. So super anecdotally, when people compare Finland to the U.S. in terms of public education, well, Finland's tax rate is probably 40%, so that they can get free medical coverage and free access to post-secondary colleges for their students, because they believe that education should be supported by citizens, versus state by state here and federally, like that you kind of roll the dice on how much public education is supported versus charter versus private, versus just our attitudes towards supporting and financially supporting education. And then you weigh in cultural aspects too, that I happen to be half Japanese, and my mom, has relayed to me conversations of her growing up in that educational system and cultural system where shame and guilt is a huge part of motivating students to achieve, and what that means. But what they don't talk about, or what you don't hear about, is adults in Japan or in other countries that don't fit the model culturally or educationally, and what happens to them because they're outside the visible perspective of like understanding what happens when you don't graduate. Similar to our system here, what happens to a high school dropout? Are they truly like homeless? Are they truly begging on the street corner? Or did they just not fit our system the way it's scaled out for them? And they had to find a different way. Maybe they're in an apprenticeship. Maybe they're, went through the GED route in a re-engagement program. And there's those hidden narratives that I think we need to do a better job of capturing, because personally, with this conversation, students that aren't making it in our high schools right now go to one re-engagement specialist, and I want him to interview all of them and ask them how we could have helped them with their hope in our system, because I think that's our option to figure out what we need to do better for our students before they start to prescribe their own pathway based on difficulties.
Does this problem run across the spectrum, or is it micro-focused on poorer kids with one mom in the household, or is this something that's just sort of widespread? You find it everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's pretty universal. Are there way more barriers and challenges through poverty? Absolutely. Relative to the incidents and opportunities that don't exist if you don't have access to money. But in the same vein, I would say that there's plenty of opportunities to look at suicide rates that come from higher SES, higher socioeconomic status households, because their prescribed version of success just looks different, right? Like our ability as individuals to measure being happy and successful has challenges regardless of our family's money status, right? So you come from a very well-to-do family on let's say the totally generalizations, the Northeast coast, where it means something to go to private school and getting into like Harvard Business School to get an MBA and work on Wall Street, right, as a financial hedge fund investor. And if you don't do that, then you're not successful. And if you don't earn, more than $1 million, then you're not successful. That's the part that becomes so difficult to like nail down, because everybody's version of that looks different, versus somebody that just is happy to live, in a rural area and like run a family farm and doesn't need aspects that other people look for in terms of happiness and like those material possessions kind of thing.
Tell me a little bit more about mom and dad, Scott. I'm fascinated. Your mom was born in Japan. How did she find her way? How did you find your way to Spokane?
Yeah, she came over for college when she was 18, and she would self-admit that she was a bit of a rebel in doing that, because obviously in a traditional Japanese family, they want you to stay, go to college, go to a very prestigious college, and then, take care of your parents when they're old. And so her it was just her and her brother, and by her leaving, she put a lot of the onus on her brother to be at home and take care of the broader family. She was supposed to return after college and didn't. She was a little bit disowned from the family for 1 to 2 years, according to her perspective. And then she met my dad, and she became a educator at the elementary and high school level for 30 plus years. And then I just got to see this empowered woman in my household buck the system that she was, and the cards that she was dealt, to be able to make her own way and redefine like her successful narrative, which I think was really encouraging for me to identify like what I wanted to do and be able to be an asset and a resource and a supporter and a cheerleader for anybody that I encountered, which is, I think, what led me into school counseling, to do that for students.
Where did she move to when she came from Japan? Did she go right to Washington State?
She actually went to Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon, outside of Portland. She went there for 4 years, and then she ended up in Spokane I'm actually forgetting what brought her here, but she got a job in Spokane schools at an elementary school here at Grant and Lincoln Heights. And then she met my dad at a costume party, and the rest is history.
I love it. Well, my mom was the first woman in my entire family to graduate from college at Chico State. It was called Chico Teachers College back in 1950 when she graduated, and I guess she was a bit of a rebel herself. So we have that in common. Well, Scott, I really can't thank you enough for being on the show. This is a fascinating topic. I think I could go on for hours, but I don't believe humans are capable of listening to an education podcast for more than 20 minutes. So I'm going to thank you for your time today and wish you all the best of luck, and would love to meet your mom next time I'm out there.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. Really appreciate it.
If you want to learn more about the show, please visit www.strategosgroup.com. Please consider subscribing on your podcast streaming platform so you don't miss out on our next episode. And until next time, I'm Todd Dallas Lamb, signing off.